Welcome to Culture of Coal with me, Alfie Norris. May 2026 marks the 100th anniversary of the General Strike, the only time such an event has occurred in British history. It was called by the Trade Union Congress in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to force the British government to prevent wage reductions and worsening conditions for the over 1 million coal miners who had been locked out of their workplace by the private mine owners. 1.7 million workers came out on strike for 9 days until the 12th of May, while the miners would remain locked out until November 1926, when they were forced to accept the lower pay and worse conditions. Herbert Smith was a miner at Glasshoughton Colliery in Castleford and president of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, the miners' union, during the General Strike, resigning in 1929 when the union agreed to lengthen miners' hours. Herbert is buried in Healfield Road Cemetery in Castleford, and now Castleford Civic Society are working with the National Union of Mine Workers to try and find Glasshoughton's missing miners' banner in time for the centenary commemoration. Today I'm joined by Kathryn Stainburn from the Civic Society to hear more about Herbert's life and the story of the missing banner. So Kathryn, can you tell me a little bit about Herbert Smith, the General Strike in Castleford? It'll give us a little bit of background about how you sort of came to be involved in that yourself as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Alfie, for giving me the opportunity to speak about Herbert Smith and Castleford and his connection to Castleford. Herbert's been described as the greatest working class fighter and trade union leader of his time. And he came from very humble beginnings, really. I mean, it's striking how his start in life and where he ended up leading the Mine Workers' Federation of Great Britain during the 1926 General Strike. He was born in July 1862 in the Great Preston workhouse. Great Preston is just up the road from us in Castleford, and his father had died in a pit accident just before his birth. His mother died shortly after he was born. He used to frequently tell audiences at trade union meetings, "I was brought up in the union," referring to his early days in the union workhouse. And from that time onwards, I've never been out of the union. Quite a good pitch, I think, really. He was in the workhouse for several years, and then he was adopted by a local Great Preston family, somebody who had the same name as him. Obviously, they weren't related, Charlotte and Samuel Smith. And he was adopted at an age, while it's not known what age he was adopted at an age at which he could remember actually being in the workhouse. So not long after being adopted by the family, they moved to County Durham. His adopted father was a miner, and he had skills in sinking pit shafts. So they travelled around for a number of years, and Herbert apparently could remember living in County Durham, South Shields area, and remembers very clearly apparently the large boats in the harbour. And then they moved back to Castleford and lived for a while on Cemetery Road, which is actually now Healfield Road, where the cemetery is.
So how did Herbert Smith get a connection then to Glasshoughton Colliery, just sort of where he's made his name? How did that come about?
The family came back to Castleford, and then Samuel got a job working at Glasshoughton Pit, which was sunk in 1863, I understand. So the year they moved to Glasshoughton isn't specifically known, but Herbert was young enough to be able to receive some education, attending a local dame school in Glasshoughton, and for a while he then attended the British school at Pontefract. But he started work at Glasshoughton Pit on his 10th birthday, and he started his union activities at a very early age. At 17 years of age, in 1879, he was a member of the Glasshoughton Miners' Union Branch Committee. So I think that's quite indicative of what he was to become, that at 17 he was already involved and committed to trade unions. He was also very active in the civic and political life of Glasshoughton and Castleford, and held a number of positions. He was elected in 1890 to the local schools board, and apparently in those days they were hotly contested elections because there was an ongoing dispute between the Church of England and the nonconformist chapels about what religious education could be taught in schools. So He was successful, but as I say, the history books tell us that it was hotly contested. And then in 1895, when he was 34, he was elected as a poor law guardian. And obviously, with his experiences of living in the poorhouse, he was a very sympathetic individual. He was also the chair of Castleford Trades Council for a number of years. And then in 1903, he was elected as a Glasshoughton councillor on the county council for Glasshoughton. So certainly well rooted in the community of Glasshoughton and Castleford. And also he had other interests as well. He was apparently quite a good boxer in his day. Had got a name for himself boxing round and about Castleford and various areas. And obviously at that time, if you were successful, you got a few quid for winning. But also he was passionate about gardening, and he remained, interestingly, a member of the Glasshoughton Oak Gardening Club for 55 years. That was after the time he moved to Barnsley. So certainly well rooted in Glasshoughton and Castleford.
And in terms of national politics and how he ended up leading the general strike, so how did that come about then?
As I said, at 17 he was elected onto the Glasshoughton Pit Miners Committee, and in 1904 he was elected Vice President of the Yorkshire Miners Association, and then in 1906 he was elected as the President. That obviously kind of introduced him to the national picture, and the Mine Workers' Federation of Great Britain had been established, I believe, in 1893, and that existed, but as there was still regional miners' associations across the country. So he was elected as Vice President of the Mine Workers' Federation of Great Britain in 1917, and then in 1922 he was elected as the President, and he stayed in that role till 1929. So he did lead the Miners' Federation of Great Britain at the time of the general strike in 1926. Coal owners were insisting on increasing the working day and reducing pay, breaking national agreements. And if miners refused to accept these terms, the coal owners would lock them out. Now, Herbert was known for his blunt speaking, uncompromising in negotiations with colliery owners, and he'd always say, I'm standing by the rights of miners. So he was certainly, I feel, the right person to be in there speaking up for the miners. So he was actually in the negotiations in Cabinet in Downing Street with the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, trying to avert the 1926 general strike. As we know, the negotiations came to nothing, and it is said that Herbert Smith had this kind of almost like party trick. I've yet to read this, but I've been told by a few reliable sources that in negotiations he would kind of pause at a certain point, pull his false teeth out, give them a polish, and you can imagine the atmosphere of doing that, slowing down the negotiations, people looking and thinking, what is he doing? And then in terms of negotiating with Stanley Baldwin, he put his teeth back in and said, no, doing. And that then was the general strike. The miners were locked out and the general strike followed 12 days afterwards. The strike ultimately failed, and the general strike collapsed, and the miners' strike, which it lasted longer, didn't it, than the general strike, ultimately failed as well. Herbert Smith left, didn't he, stood down from his position. As we know, the general strike lasted for 12 days, and you'll be able to do a whole other podcast on the general strike, and maybe at some point we can talk again about potentially general strike in Castleford. But yeah, you're quite right. The general strike just lasted 12 days, and the miners stayed out until October of that year, 1926, and went back. It was a defeat. There's no doubt it was a defeat. But Herbert stayed in his position as president of the Mine Workers' Federation of Great Britain until 1929. And at that time, he resigned on a point of principle. He'd always supported the 8-hour day and a reduction in the 8-hour day. But nationally, it was agreed to lengthen the miners' day. And the Yorkshire Miners Association weren't in favour of that. So he stood down as a point of principle in 1929. But he continued in his role as with the Yorkshire Miners Association. And ultimately, it was in 1938, working at his desk in the NUM headquarters as they are now, that he died suddenly. And the reaction to his funeral quite
quite a big thing, wasn't it, across sort of Yorkshire from Barnsley to Castleford?
Absolutely. Amazing, amazing. And I've been lucky enough to meet Herbert's granddaughter, and she has the newspaper cuttings from the time and, you know, the photographs, you know, of the cortege, of the funeral procession, I'll say, the amount of people who were on the streets, the tributes. It really was a big, big thing. He was much beloved. And all the way from Barnsley to Castleford, the streets were lined. And when it came to Castleford, the hearse was progressing up Hillfield Road. The actual street was thronged with people, really. So he lived to a good age. He died at 75 and he died in harness, but he was still obviously extremely popular then. And he was referred to, and I've seen the poems that were written about him, or the verse that was written about him, and he's referred to as our Herb.
You're on a mission now tonight to find where he worked at Glasshoughton. They had a banner made, didn't they? Am I right in thinking it was in the 1980s? There was a new banner made at Glasshoughton, or before that?
I think it was before that, yeah. I think it's certainly the second banner. Sorry, Alfie.
No. You're on a mission to find that banner because it's the anniversary of the general strike next year. So what are your plans if you find the banner, and what would you like to do with it?
Castleford Civic Society have a cemetery heritage trail, and Herbert Smith's grave is included in this. And as a consequence of the discussions around the cemetery trail, we thought, coming up to the 1926 general strike, it would be good to kind of recognise Herbert in some way in the role that he played, you know, as a significant individual, both, you know, nationally and internationally. And we decided that we would like to rededicate his grave. So we fundraised to refresh his grave, recarve it. And we're also organising, with the support of the family, a rededication service, which will be May 2026, the centenary of the general strike. And we just thought it would be fantastic, bearing in mind that Herbert, you know, started working in Glasshoughton, if we could have the Glasshoughton NUM banner at that service. Now, we're aware it's been missing for some time. It is the second banner of Glasshoughton NUM pit, and I think it might have been made late 60s. When I've seen photographs of it, it certainly looks to be of that period. But speaking to people who worked at Glasshoughton, they last remember seeing it when it was the march back to work in 84, 85. We've recently heard that someone might have spotted it a bit more recent than that, but we're just really keen that it's there at this rededication service. There will be other banners there, but it would be really fantastic if it could be found and be at that ceremony. And if anybody did have any information or had any knowledge of where it is, how would they best contacting you? Via Castleford Civic Society. Castleford Civic Society have a Facebook page and also an email address, castlefordcivicsociety@gmail.com, but also contact you as well, Alfie, because you've been very supportive in helping to find it. So yeah, if anybody's listening and you know where it is, please get in touch. Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you, Alfie.